Hey, welcome back. So conditional formatting has shown us how adding some visual effects to our data can help us gain insights and draw attention to relevant values. But sometimes the raw data itself isn't the best mechanism for conveying these insights or understanding. Computers are great at processing large tables of numbers quickly, but human beings aren't computers, and sometimes the meaning of our data gets lost amid a forest of individual data points. You know the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words? Sometimes a picture can also be worth 1,000 data points. And that's where charts come in. Charts are basically visual representations of data that are separate from the data itself. A good chart should tell a story about the data it is based on that provides summary and insight that a human being can easily grasp and use to make decisions. Excel has extremely powerful charting capabilities and a wide variety of charts that we can use to visually describe our data. However, there are a handful that are used more often than others, so we're going to focus on those. So without further ado, let's paint a picture of some data with a little help from Excel. Now, this being a course focused on business intelligence, we're going to make use of a special kind of chart called a pivot chart, which is constructed in much the same way as a pivot table, and has all the same advantages in terms of being dynamic, as well as being connected to our data model, and thus able to potentially summarize millions of rows of data. We can construct a pivot chart as a standalone entity, or build a pivot table first, and then create a pivot chart based on that. While for many purposes you may not want or need the pivot table alongside your pivot chart, for starters, it's a good idea to start with just a pivot table to clarify your thoughts on exactly what data you're trying to visualize. So with all that said, let's start our charting adventures with a simple pivot table with region on rows and order SLA percentage on values. So I'll go to Insert, Pivot Table, and then I'll put region on rows, and then our new orders with an SLA metric on values. And now that we've got our pivot table in place, let's see how we can visualize the data within it with a pivot chart. So over on the right side of our Pivot Table Analyze Contextual tab on the ribbon, you see this Pivot Chart button. So if I click that, now Excel gives us a long list of charts that we can apply to the data in our pivot. For starters, I'm going to choose a chart called a bar chart. So I'll select that, and now we actually get a little preview of what our data will look like, visualized with a bar chart, and then we'll click OK. And now just to see this a little more clearly, I'll get rid of my field list, drag it over, and then widen it out just a bit. And as you can see, the layout of the bar chart is fairly straightforward. Regions with a higher SLA percentage get a larger bar, whereas regions with a smaller SLA percentage get a smaller bar. In this sense, bar charts work a lot like the data bars we had applied to our pivot tables previously with conditional formatting. Now, I chose a bar chart intentionally for the data that we're laying out in this particular pivot table because bar charts tend to be good at helping us visualize a comparison between different items, which is basically what we're doing here. So briefly, I'd like to recap the components of this chart, which are similar to the components of any chart that we'll see. First is the data series. This is the actual visualization in the pivot table. For a bar chart, that's these bars that you see. For other charts, it might be a different type of visualization. But the bottom line is, it's the visual component that represents the numbers that you're plotting in the chart. Up next is the category axis, which breaks out whatever metric it is that we're visualizing by the items within a certain field. In our case, that field being our region field. Then going horizontally across the bottom of the chart is the axis that gives scale to the actual measure that we're plotting in the pivot chart. This lets us know how tall a tall bar actually is. And we see that the tallest, or I guess it would be more accurate to say widest, bar in our bar chart here is for the West North Central region, which is all the way out at 100%. Further, all the way over at the right where you see the word total, is the legend of our chart, which you'll see the value for later, but with a simple chart like this just doesn't have a lot of utility. And then at the very top, where you also see the word total, is the title of our chart. Now obviously a chart title consisting of the word total isn't terribly useful either, but fortunately, like with almost every part of a chart, we can customize this to make it work for us. Finally, pivot charts come equipped with filters that allow us to filter the categories whose performances we're visualizing in the chart. So if I click this Name Filter button, I can actually selectively filter for just certain regions that I might want to see in our pivot chart. Now, to be honest, this is often not a terribly useful feature, and as we'll see later, it's something that you can get rid of to make more room for the other elements of your chart. But for now, I'll undo those filters. And now that we've seen the basic components of a chart, let's take a look at modifying one. So our horizontal axis at the bottom of our pivot chart goes out to 120%. But that really doesn't make a lot of sense because our orders with an SLA measure could only ever go as high as 100%. So if we want to change the scale of that axis, we first click it to select it, and then right-click and choose Format Axis. And now if we look at the Bounds section, we'll see the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1.2. But what really makes sense is for the maximum to just be 1. So let's change that, and then close out of this. And now you'll see that our axis has a much more sensible range from 0 to 100%. Also, I'm going to change this sort of nonsensical title here to read Order SLA by Region. Now another way you can customize your pivot charts is to apply one of a really large number of pre-configured formats that Excel gives you for your charts. Now with our chart selected, Excel brings up several new contextual tabs on our ribbon. The one we're on now is Format. There's also the Pivot Chart Analyze tab, which lets us change the fundamental construction of our pivot chart in much the same way you would a pivot table. And then there's the Design tab, which includes these pre-configured chart styles. So if I click this button at the bottom right of that list of styles, I can now hover over them just to get a preview of the various types of styles I can apply to my chart with a single click. Now for now, I'll leave it at this somewhat vanilla default style, but again, depending on your personal tastes and the tastes of your audience, you could go with a much flashier style with a lot more pizzazz like this, or if you're a boring guy like me, you can just stick with the plain vanilla default. It's entirely up to you. Now when dealing with pivot charts, it's worth noting that Excel will try to convert almost any pivot table to a pivot chart, but for complicated pivot tables, this usually won't go well. As such, until you get a good intuition for creating pivot charts, it's best that you be very intentional about what fields you add and create your pivot table with the chart in mind, not with the chart as an afterthought. So just as an example here, let's add state as an additional layer to our pivot table. So I'll go back into my pivot table Analyze tab, and then our field list, and then I'll go down to my states table and drag in state below region. And now if we look back at our pivot chart, it is dutifully attempting to visualize the hierarchy in our pivot table, but not doing a particularly great job of this. In fact, this pivot chart is what folks of the younger generation would probably refer to as a hot mess. So because this is giving me a headache already, I think I'm going to go ahead and remove state from our pivot table. And now we're back to a more sensible layout for our pivot chart. So now that we have some intuition for how pivot charts work, let's try our hand at creating one from scratch without an underlying pivot table. So first, let's go ahead and delete this chart, and then I'll even delete the underlying pivot table as well. And now I'll recreate the view that we just saw, but only using a pivot chart without bothering with that underlying pivot table. So I'll go to my Insert tab, And now instead of hitting the pivot table button, I'll hit the pivot chart button. And you see that we have the option to either create a pivot chart or a combined pivot chart and pivot table. But the second option would be pretty much what we just did in our last example. So we'll choose pivot chart, and we'll create it from our data model just like we always do our pivot tables. And now Excel is telling us to turn on the pivot chart field list to work with the pivot chart. And the field list for pivot charts works almost exactly like the field list for pivot tables. So we'll click this field list button on the pivot chart analyze tab. And now we're able to drag fields into these different squares just like when we're constructing a pivot table. First, we'll drag in our measure into the values area. So we'll go to our orders table and drag in orders with an SLA. And you see that with nothing to break this measure out by, we just get one tall column representing that measure for all categories not broken out by any particular thing. Next, to break this out by region, I'll drag the name field from our regions table into the categories axis. That's always going to be the component of our pivot table that breaks out this single bar that you see by the values in that field. So for our regions field, instead of seeing a single bar, we'll see a different bar for each individual region in our data. And now finally, because we're not seeing a bar chart here and we're trying to recreate our original view, with this chart selected, I'll go to the Design Contextual tab, and then I'll hit this Change Chart Type button. And this takes us to the dialog box we saw originally, which lets us select what type of chart we want to use to visualize our data. So I'll choose bar, and then OK. And then I can quickly make the formatting adjustments that I made previously. I'll widen our chart out. I'll fix the scale of the axis. I'll change the title. And there we have it. We have the same visualization we had before, but without the clutter of that underlying pivot table, which is important if all we're interested in is the high-level visualization without seeing the numbers behind it. Now, a major advantage of pivot charts is our ability to control them with slicers, which are just as effective and user-friendly a tool for applying filters to pivot charts as they are for pivot tables. So let's say I want to be able to slice and dice this pivot chart by whether or not the customers for these orders were loyalty club members. So with our pivot chart selected, I'll go to the Pivot Chart Analyze tab and then hit Insert Slicer. And then on that dialog box, so I can access tables that are not among the tables that are in our pivot, I'll hit the All tab as opposed to the Active tab. And then I'll go to our Customers table and choose Loyalty Club Member, and then OK. And now we have a slicer that again will let us filter our values for whether or not a customer is a Loyalty Club member. So I'll drag this out of the way of our pivot and then shorten it up a bit and also widen it out a bit. And now I can control the underlying data of our chart simply by selecting different values in our Loyalty Club member slicer. Now it's worth noting that as with pivot tables, you can actually control multiple pivot charts with a single slicer, or have multiple slicers that each control multiple pivot charts. This gives you the ability to create dynamic reporting and dynamic dashboards with ease. Now, we briefly saw earlier a glimpse of another type of chart when we first created this pivot chart from scratch. So let's explore that a little bit more and convert our bar chart here back to that particular kind of chart. So with our pivot chart selected, I'll go back to our Design tab and then Change Chart Type, and then I'll go back to the type of chart we saw before, which was a column chart, and then click OK. Now, while for the purposes of the simple visualization we're doing here, our column chart really isn't accomplishing anything our bar chart wasn't, column charts are also more versatile than bar charts. To that, up next, we're going to continue our exploration of pivot charts in general and column charts in particular by incorporating a time component into our visualizations. I'll see you then.